folks. Thanks for coming along tonight, where Michael Stutchbury makes a first appearance at the Sydney Institute. He's well known to you, but I'll introduce him briefly in a minute, and discussing the last 4 decades' reflections on the Australian economy. Now, as you know, Michael is a former, until very recently, but he's a former editor-in-chief of the Australian Financial Review, and in journalism his background is in the Advertiser in Adelaide, then to Financial Review, then to the Australian, and then back to the Financial Review. And in this period of time he's written predominantly on economics and politics, and he has published a number of collected works. But tonight the topic is the last 4 decades, reflections on the Australian economy. Michael, you're very welcome. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Gerard, and great to be here at the Sydney Institute, a real institute of Sydney and Sydney intellectual life. I'm here to tell a ripping yarn about the past 4 decades of the Australian economy. It's the story of how Australia turned from being a mediocre country into one of the world's most prosperous nations. But it's also a story of how this is now under threat. 4 decades goes back to the early 1980s, when the Financial Review's then editor, Paddy McGuinness, hired me to become the paper's industrial relations writer based in Melbourne, very much in Gerard's territory. I just spent a year or so in Canberra as a junior economic analyst in Malcolm Fraser's Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet. And before that, I'd grown up in Adelaide in the 1970s, doing a journalist cadetship on the local paper, The Advertiser, and finishing an honours degree in economics at the University of Adelaide. To bookend the then and now of these past 4 decades, I'll refer to the observations of 2 foreigners: Singapore's founding Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew and the former Bank of England official Andrew Hauser, who this year became the Reserve Bank of Australia's Deputy Governor. Sometime in the late 70s, or perhaps 1980, along with others I've vainly sought to pin down exactly where and when, Lee Kuan Yew famously warned that Australia risked becoming the white trash of Asia. The white trash phrase was picked up by others, including CRA Chief Executive Rod Carnegie, who had set up McKinsey's in Australia in the early 1960s and who passed away last month. It became a description of Australian decline that was echoed by claims over the next decade. Australia was likened to a frog being boiled alive in a vat of foreign debt. And then Paul Keating famously warned that Australia risked becoming a banana republic. By the late 1970s, Australia had become a mediocre country. The excitement of the 1960s mining booms, including in nickel, and the beginnings of the Pilbara iron ore export boom, gave way to the global stagflation of the early 1970s and the mayhem of the Whitlam government. The Fraser government pursued a fight inflation first strategy, but it failed to tackle the basic problem of an overprotected and over-regulated economy. Import protection preserved 80% of the local car market to the local manufacturing outposts of foreign automakers. In the sky, regulation deliberately suppressed competition through the infamous domestic 2 airline policy. Governments ran and sometimes even monopolised airlines, banks, power stations and phone companies. As a young treasurer, John Howard pushed for reform, including to the tax system, through a consumption tax that would finance cuts to Australia's punishingly high income tax. While Howard was stymied by Fraser on that, he did manage to get up one big thing: a review of the financial system by Hooker Corporation Chief Executive Keith Campbell that laid down the intellectual foundations for the financial deregulation of the 1980s. The Fraser government reversed course on fight inflation first when the second OPEC oil shock sparked a boom in steaming coal development based in Queensland. The Financial Review ran a page 1 splash headline, "Australia's Brilliant Coal Future." Australia continues to export a lot of coal, but the late 1970s resources boom was blown up by trade union strikes demanding much higher pay for significantly less work. In Washington, US Fed Chair Paul Volcker jacked up interest rates to break the OPEC oil cartel and to crunch inflation. By 1982, Paddy McGuinness predicted across the top of page 1 of the Fin Review that Australia was headed for recession. Hit by the collapse of global energy prices, a US recession, and an inflated domestic cost base. Unlike in other countries, such as the US, Australia did not reap the recession dividend then of lower inflation, even as the jobless rate again hit double digits. It was a mess. And from the ACTU, Bob Hawke grabbed the Labor leadership. He beat Fraser at the March 1983 election, and he held an economic summit based around the idea of consensus, at which Rod Carnegie led the big business delegation and I covered as a junior Financial Review reporter. The only thing left then was an incomes policy, the wages accord with the ACTU that was supposed to deliver a cut in real wages, restore company profits, boost business investment and wind back the inflation as the economy recovered. And it did do a fair bit of that. It was a pivotal moment in the story of prosperous modern Australia. So the foundations of today's prosperity began first with the shock of that early 1980s recession, which rammed home the point that Australia needed to change course. But also important was the work, often in the background, by an assortment of people who built the case for a more deregulated and open economy. There was Alf Ratigan, the mild-mannered head of the Tariff Board, the predecessor of today's Productivity Commission, who took on the protectionists. There were editors and writers at the Financial Review, from Max Newton in the 1960s through to Paddy McGuinness. Paddy and Gerard Henderson were both fierce critics of the Industrial Relations Club. An intellectual rabble-rouser called Ozzie Holmes shook up things at the Reserve Bank as the Campbell inquiry was urging a more market-based approach to the financial system. Liberal backbencher Bert Kelly mocked protection in his modest member column in the Financial Review. The National Farmers Federation under David Trebek and Andrew Robb overturned the protection all round of the Country Party under Black Jack McEwen. There were the Liberal Dries, including John Hyde and the Institute of Public Affairs, and in Sydney, the Centre for Independent Studies. There was the background inspiration from the Reagan and Thatcher revolutions in the US and the UK as Hayek and Friedman took the intellectual mantle from John Maynard Keynes. But the explosive device in all of this was the 39-year-old treasurer from the New South Wales Labor right, Paul Keating. Keating had left school at 14, but he had been schooled in economics by Max Walsh in the Financial Review's pokey office in the old Parliament House. Keating smashed Labor shibboleths. He ridiculed the Labor left unions, such as the metal workers, for putting 100,000 Australians out of work in the recession. Old Labor wanted to nationalise Australia's banks. Keating Labor let in foreign banks, Citibank, JP Morgan, Deutsche Bank and others, to compete with them. On Friday, December the 9th, 1983, basically 9 months after winning government, Keating and Hawke floated the Australian dollar. That put one of the economy's most important prices in the hands of the market rather than of bureaucrats and politicians. The Financial Review called it a brave new world. The cut in real wages from the accord, agreed to by the unions, made the economy competitive again on international markets and underwrote a jobs boom. Keating vowed to set the sails for growth and hold on tight. But it hit the rocks in mid-1986 with a slump in Australia's commodity export prices that caused a balance of payments blowout and a run on the Australian dollar. It was like a currency crisis. Keating phoned into John Law's 2UE talkback radio show and basically off the cuff declared that without a big adjustment, Australia risked ending up a third-rate economy, a banana republic. And what did he mean by this? He meant discounting wage indexation for the inflationary effect of the lower dollar. He meant the belt-tightening of a big budget consolidation driven with Finance Minister Peter Walsh to get Australia living within its means. And he meant a supply-side revolution, including the dismantling of the import protection wall, privatisation of government businesses such as the Commonwealth Bank, Qantas and the Commonwealth Serum Laboratory, CSL, and by the early 1980s, with the ACT Bill Kelty, Keating also meant the end of centralised wage fixing and the start of enterprise bargaining to funnel all the other reforms to drive productivity growth at the shop floor level. This was the microeconomic reform agenda that some knew as dry economics or supply-side economics or economic rationalism, or even pejoratively today as neoliberalism. Of course, something else was running alongside all this policy wonk stuff. Unleashed by financial deregulation, the 1980s was also the decade of debt-fuelled so-called entrepreneurs or corporate raiders such as Alan Bond, Robert Holmes à Court, John Elliott, John Spalvins and Christopher Skase, hired as a cadet journalist by Trevor Sykes in the Melbourne Bureau of the Financial Review. Holmes à Court almost succeeded in taking over Australia's biggest company, BHP. The corporate raiders shook up the sleepy and often state-based industrial structures that had been cosseted by all this regulation. It was a global phenomenon. In the US, Michael Milken, who I caught up with in Sydney just a couple of months ago, famously developed high-yield bonds, or junk bonds. It was the decade of greed is good, and it blew up with the October 1987 share market crash, the biggest share market crash since 1929. At the Financial Review, Paddy McGuinness predicted a deep recession, even a depression, and a massive housing bust. Instead, the opposite happened. As central banks all eased monetary policy around the world, the global economy bounced back and Australia experienced a debt-fuelled speculative asset price boom, including for housing and commercial property. The Reserve Bank, which had really been in the background with all of this behind the accord, responded. This is the Reserve Bank that wasn't politically independent, but it responded by lifting its cash rate from 11% to 18%, putting today's 4.35% cash rate that is supposedly smashing the economy into some perspective. It burst the asset price bubble. The economy fell into what Keating called the recession we had to have. Westpac almost went broke. The State Bank of Victoria was rescued by the Commonwealth Bank, turning it into the truly national bank we see today and one of the most highly priced banks in the world. Rather than a wages blowout recession, this was a financial bubble recession that again pushed up the jobless rate to double digits. But unlike a decade before, it came with an unexpected bonus. This time, it snapped the inflation stick. For the first time since the stagflation of the early 1970s, Australia joined the ranks of the low inflation world. The Reserve Bank opportunistically took advantage of this to introduce its 2 to 3% inflation target, taking the cue of the other central banks such as in New Zealand, Canada and the Bank of England. After John Howard won the 1996 election, new Treasurer Peter Costello formalised the Reserve Bank's operational independence to deliver its 2 to 3% inflation target, the thing they're arguing about now. Costello's 1996 budget delivered another sizable fiscal consolidation to get the budget books in order. So together, the RBA's low inflation target, the fiscal consolidation and the floating dollar provided the stable foundations that in turn supported the microeconomic policy reforms, and delivered the low inflation productivity boost of the 1990s. Australia stopped being a mediocre country. In the decade of equity rather than debt, the consensus of Australian policy echoed the American Democrat modernisation of Bill Clinton, it's the economy stupid, and Tony Blair's modernisation of UK Labor. Then came something that no one really predicted. Recall that the Banana Republic fear of 1986 was that commodity exporting Australia was trapped by a long-run decline in our terms of trade. That's the ratio of export prices to import prices. The idea that was commodity prices were on a downward trend compared to the prices of manufactured goods. Australia would have to dig more and more out of the ground to pay for the same amount of manufactured imports. That would amount to a recurring national pay cut. Perhaps Australia should subsidise a computer chip making industry, as IBM urged the Howard government to do, with a subsidy, of course, from taxpayers. By the late 1990s, RBA Governor Ian Macfarlane, though, started thinking that the reverse might be the case, amid the stirring of the big emerging market economies such as India and China. Perhaps the prices of manufactured items such as computer chips would fall relative to the prices of commodities, including the minerals we extracted from the Earth's crust. China joined the World Trade Organization in late 2001. On the one hand, China flooded the world with cheaper factory goods that Australia bought. On the other hand, it sharply increased the demand for commodities such as iron ore and coal that Australia sold. Australia became the preferred supplier of the raw materials into the blast furnaces of the biggest industrial revolution the world had seen. Unlike the late 1970s coal boom, the floating dollar meant that the China boom did not blow up the economy. Instead, as the Australian dollar rose to US $1.10, the subscale and high-cost Australian car industry was finally squeezed out. Being able to import cheaper cars allowed the economy to focus on where it could actually make things for a profit. Among other things, it made the fortunes of iron ore barons Andrew Forrest and Gina Reinhardt. Australia became the world's biggest exporter of liquefied natural gas. From the early 1990s recession through to the US $180 a tonne peak of the iron ore price in 2011, and then to the pandemic, Australia enjoyed 3 decades of unbroken economic growth. We got through the East Asian financial crisis of 97 and 98, the tech wreck bursting of the dot-com bubble in 2000 and 2001, and then the global financial crisis of 2008, all without a recession, unique in the world. Australia's per capita disposable household income, it's a measure of sort of prosperity of the people, grew in real terms by 2/3. Real per capita disposable household income up by 2/3. Australia became a serious, prosperous G20 country. Just over a couple of months ago, the RBA's new deputy, Andrew Hauser, delivered a revealing message. Australians have forgotten, if they ever really appreciated, just how prosperous they had become. Like being, as he pointed out, in the top echelon of global affluence. On the latest numbers, Australia per capita GDP is 15% higher than Sweden, 23% higher than Germany and Israel, incredibly 91% higher than Japan, and nearly 5 times higher than in Russia. And it's 32% higher than in the UK per capita GDP. 32% higher in Australia than the UK. And as Hauser says, living here rather than there, it feels that way too. But the latest official intergenerational report, thing that Peter Costello set up, projects that Australia's annual economic growth will average just 2.2% over the next 40 years, down from 3.1% over the past 40 years we're talking about. So it's going from 3.1% down to 2.2%. That should be unacceptable for a frontier, resource-rich, migrant-receiving economy at the foot of Asia. Australia's modern prosperity really peaked just after the GFC at the top of the China resources boom. There has been no substantial and lasting productivity reform since John Howard's GST reform nearly a quarter of a century ago. In some areas, such as industrial relations and taxation, it's going backwards. The unions and the Rudd-Gillard government kneecapped Keating's enterprise bargaining pretty quickly. Haunted by work choices, the subsequent coalition governments showed no interest in reframing the whole adversarial basis of Australian industrial relations. In taxation, the lack of any reform aspiration or principles mean that the tax changes that do go through are unprincipled and ad hoc as the tax system piles more of the burden onto incentive and enterprise. The latest national accounts, out just last week, show that GDP per hour worked, labour productivity, has not grown since 2016. And we can't rely on something just falling out of the sky, such as the China boom of the 2000s, to again come to the aid of the lucky country. The China boom surely has well and truly peaked. China's population is now falling. Australians can't expect much more growth from our iron ore exports, our number one export, and the assertiveness of Xi Jinping means Australia needs to reinvest some of its China boom booty into national security, such as through AUKUS. Australia got rich as a fossil fuel intensive economy, including coal and LNG, but now this has to decarbonise. We do have big opportunities in the sun, wind, minerals from lithium to copper, and perhaps green iron. But it's much harder than some have made out, especially given that Australia's cost base has blown out in ways that will make many projects internationally uncompetitive. The globalisation that followed the fall of the Berlin Wall and supported Australia's modern prosperity has been replaced by deglobalisation, driven by the return of geopolitical rivalry, sharpened by Vladimir Putin, and national sovereignty-based supply chains. China's export-based growth model we benefited from flooded American and European markets, undermined their industrial bases, and helped produce the populist backlash of Brexit and Trump. Rather than the fiscal discipline of the late 1980s budgets and the first Howard Costello budget, Joe Hockey's 2014 budget hit a political wall. Rather than Labor v Capital, politics is now fashioned around personal identity and cultural tribalism, and rather than generating wealth, politics has become about redistributing wealth in the name of inclusion and leaving no one behind. The highest inflation rate since before the 1990s recession has been caused by the massive budget and monetary stimulus response to the pandemic spilling over the economy's disrupted supply capacity. The left-right populism of the Greens and the Nationals tries to blame it on supermarket price gouging. Treasurer Jim Chalmers snipes at a reserve bank that has been overloaded with the responsibility of bringing inflated aggregate demand back within the economy's supply capacity. Amid all this, government spending has ratcheted up by 2% of GDP, adding to demand without boosting supply. The increased structural outlays are concentrated in low productivity spending monuments, such as the NDIS and the Onsky Schools funding of progressively worse student results. Politics is set to get even madder next year, most likely under a minority Labor government that, like the Coalition, has no credible growth agenda. In the long cycle of things, we are back to a place similar in some ways to the 1970s, where we started. The task now will be to preserve as much of the foundations of the prosperity built up over the past 40 years on which to assemble a new coalition for growth. Encouragingly, and I'll conclude on this, most Australians aren't really interested in tribal identity politics and culture wars. Most Australians just want well-paying jobs to help raise their families. They want safe communities, good schools, and a strong economy. So the task will be to rebuild a coalition of the aspirational centre, like with the Hawke Keating and Howard Costello governments, to deliver that over the next 4 decades. Thank you very much.
So many thanks to Michael Stutchbury for a great analysis of Australia's economy over the last 40 years and 3 or 4 words about the next 40 years. Can I just go back to where you started? And as I look at what you were saying, these reforms the reforms that you've identified essentially came after, to some extent, the 1970s, mid-70s recession, and more so the early 80s recession, and more so again the early 90s recession. and since then there hasn't been a recession. So do you need some kind of very harsh recession to make politicians and others embrace further economic reform, or is that now something that's past us and we'll need something else?
Well, I certainly hope not. And you would have thought there's been enough big shocks to the system. You would have thought the GFC was a pretty scary thing when it happened, and you would have thought that would galvanise the system to say, well, this has been a bit of a shock. We've really got to get our act together. But we got out of that largely because China came to the rescue and started buying the iron ore pretty quickly after just a very short interruption. So we came out of that very strongly, and the iron ore price went up further after the GFC. So we had, the more money kept on coming in. Even in this, you'd think the pandemic, you'd think, well, that's a bit of a shock. That should get people to focus on, how do we make ourselves more productive and more efficient. Instead, I think it really encouraged the idea that governments are there to protect everyone. So you had the whole sort of the politics and the economics of the health-related shutdowns, and everyone can have their views on all of that. Went that too far, but it's certainly people and the population seem to, according to how they voted in various state governments, wanted to have governments to protect them, and regardless of the sort of impact that might have. And so with all the sort of the bounty that we've got out of, the real great achievement of the reforms of the 80s and 90s, and then riding the China boom, the great luck, and driving that has produced a very wealthy economy. And so politics is really arguing, we're very wealthy, we're arguing over that cream, and that's what politics is going to become about. And so we don't have, people are talking about there's going to be a recession, but the demand for labour is still way above supply at the moment. The amount of job vacancies compared to employment is still much higher than before the recession. So I think we've got to go through. The question will be, once we get through this stage and inflation comes down, and we'll see whether it comes down more or less according to plan. It's been a bit stickier than people have thought. Maybe it stays a bit stickier, or maybe it comes down. It's hard to say. It could come down. But then out of all of that, maybe interest rates start to come down a little bit next year. But that's just really the start of it all. Where do you start to get your growth from? What's your growth model after all that? We've really inflated our cost base, and which means that a lot of projects that we want to do for this new economy will be uncompetitive. We won't be able to build them competitively enough. What is the growth model? There's no, there's nothing there to do that. So I think there needs to be a debate. I think it'll take a while for the political process, particularly as it splinters, to really come to grips with it.
Michael, great talk. Great to hear. Great talk, and great to hear a long-term editor being so concise in the way in which you've put everything together tonight over a 40-year period. I think back to Federation, and the fact that the Constitution provided for conciliation and arbitration, actually embedded in a way that, as far as I know, it doesn't exist in any other Western country. That to me seems to be the sort of influence that continues to empower the labour movement to have an authority that, for instance, it has nothing like that in the United States or in the United Kingdom, but it's perpetuated here and seems so out of date. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's one of the Federation settlement of the White Australia policy, protection and conciliation and arbitration, with a very intrusive system of labour regulation built around the idea that came out of the 1890s. As Gerard and others would know, the 1890s, shearers' strikes and the marriage on the waterfront. So we're going to have a new province of law and order, whereby you'd have an umpire that would conciliate between big nasty capital and the poor workers, the disenfranchised workers that would line up at the Hungry Mile on the waterfront, and they needed some protection. Of course, the world's changed incredibly since then. There's the workers the workers in Australia are very prosperous by global standards. There's no sort of working class per se. It's a middle class. They've got as much capital in their pocket as IBM had in 1960. They've got big stakes in a lot of the system through the compulsory superannuation, another element of the overall story in the past and going forward. So it's a system which lives on and struggles. You struggle to reform it. So you can see the coalition really hasn't taken the opportunity to say, well, let's get away from this adversarial system. The Fair Work Ombudsman, Anna Booth, used to work for the textile unions. She's ACTU Senior Vice President. She said, about 15 years ago, that the Australian industrial relations system is really built around maintaining adversarial work relations. You needed a boss and workers. They're inherently adversarial, and you needed to have something rather than how can we get sort of win-win outcomes and have cooperation so that we get more productive at the workplace and then try to everyone can have higher wages and higher profits, and we sustain a high wage economy that can compete in the global marketplace. How can we do that? Of course, when Keating was trying to do that with the enterprise bargaining system, so at least you'd be bargaining at an enterprise level, shop floor level, and you'd try to get productivity gains, and then you'd be able to get higher wages and maintain your profits. But of course, they brought in, I get mixed up with the better off overall and the other test. But basically, they made the test harder under the unions, and they didn't really like that, what Keating had done, and the Gillard-Rudd government didn't like it. So if any one person, someone who collected the shopping trolleys outside one of the supermarkets on a Thursday night, one night a week, was worse off because you traded off penalty rates for an overall base rate of pay, and that one person was worse off, or even an imaginary worker who might have had a certain type of shift arrangements was worse off, then the thing would fall apart. So it was deliberately designed to kneecap that. And now, of course, we see things going backwards. At the government's Jobs and Skills Summit, that was a stitch up to try and get all the bosses there, and then to say, well, you've agreed to pattern bargaining again. So that's the old days. That's not a productivity base. That's a strong element. Gets a beachhead. They charge. They storm the beaches. They manage to knock over one employer, and then they just spread it to everybody else through the system. So the coalition just hasn't taken this on. The scars of work choices are still there, and they haven't come up with the things to say, let's just reframe the whole thing. Let's talk about it completely different. Let's get away from all of this. And I think that's something that's for the next decade or two a real project to people to focus on.
Michael, great talk. I go back further than you, I think, and remember the Whitlam years, and it seems that we've gone back to the Whitlam approach to the budget, the treasurer, whatever. The sticky inflation, according to the RBA, seems to be because of government spending, which is Whitlam-esque. And every time $1 billion is thrown at this or that, it usually goes to a heap of bureaucrats rather than gets to the actual where it's meant to be. And this is born out of probably 2 decades of living off borrowing, living off easy money. So where is all this in the mix of where we've come from and where we might have to go?
Yeah. So I think it's not quite as bad as the Whitlam government, which was truly mad. It's not quite as bad as all of that. But I think it is true that now there is no fiscal policy. People talk about monetary policy, and it's got a framework. It's got a 2 to 3% inflation target. You know what the instrument is. So over the medium term, they're held to account that there sort of literally is no fiscal policy. There's in the budget papers, there used to be a thing that said, well, we're going to have, over the course of the cycle, we commit to having a balance or even a small surplus over the course. It didn't really deliver it. But there's no framework from which to anchor expectations, a bit like monetary policy on the system. Say no, we can't spend this because we've got a goal that we've got to get back to surplus, because we need to rebuild the fiscal buffers in case we get another thing and we want to spend a whole lot more money again. Otherwise, we're going to have to just jack up the foreign debt again. So there's no real discipline now on the system, and none of the political parties seems to be interested in imposing it. And you see this around the world. And some people say, one of the RBA people who are just exiting there the other day said expected that the next crisis is a government debt crisis led by the US. You know, over there, they made a deal where the Democrats the Democrats will never oppose any spending increase, and the Republicans won't approve any tax hike. So you don't get a tax hike, you get the spending increases, so you widen it. And so they've got a real sort of fiscal sustainability question. And at some stage, does that become the next sort of crisis? Because there's not a discipline on fiscal policy. And you see when Labor came in 2007 and the Swan wanted to bring in the mining tax and all that, that was an attempt to take the cream off the mining boom, and you could have a case for some sort of resource rent tax as part of an overall tax package, which really sharpened the incentives and everybody gave a bit, but really wanted to take that and spend it on things like the NDIS and the Gonski school funding, and they're not very high productive. These are old style Whitlam-esque spending monuments, and most Labor politicians want to come up with that and say universal childcare. That's the thing that we've left you.
Just before we go to the next question, just following on what you said, you mentioned Peter Walsh briefly as Finance Minister in the Hawke government, and I guess the hard person in the Howard government on expenditure was probably Peter Costello and John Fay, who was the Finance Minister. We know more about them. Tell us, what do you think of Peter Walsh's role? You mentioned him in your speech.
Yeah, well, he was the hard man from Western Australia, the wheat farmer. There's a great tradition of them, and he was the one who would do along with Keating, getting the spending under control in that period after the Banana Republic, where we did lose national income because for a while there the export prices fell a lot, so you had to just basically tighten the belts. They had to bring back a lot of the spending. They didn't come in with Hawke and Keating didn't come in with, well, let's attack the budget. Really, they weren't in with that. They were saying, let's control the unions and we'll grow like that. But ended up they had to deal with the budget as well. So he was quite an essential point person in all of that. You don't see a Peter Walsh in the current Labor government, or you don't see one anywhere really.
Thank you. Talk was pretty comprehensive. As you intimated, there are been quite a lot of very perceptive politicians and leaders at some point in time, all in the national interest, possibly ending with Howard and Costello. If another leader or team was to emerge at the moment with the same sort of perceptions, it's my view that they're going to have to make some pretty hard decisions and do some very solid, hard arguing. Do you think that large slabs, or the majority of the Australian population, would be open to accepting the sort of hard arguments and discipline that is needed?
I don't think any time soon. I think the thing is now that politics has become so fractured that it's hard to get a majority government with any sort of majority and to get authority. And so that makes, it's got to be what the people want. You do need leadership on all of this, and you need to have a narrative. You need to have, a narrative that's accepted by thought leaders and almost intellectuals, if you like, have to build a program that can provide a convincing story about what the national situation is, and provide a convincing story, and then to get it through the political process. But you see here now, next year, it's going to be minority Labor government, most likely. What are they going to do with deals with the Greens? They're fighting on the Green flank. They're fighting the Coalition. The Coalition has gone sort of blue-collar populist almost. They've gone a little bit anti-business in some ways. The Teals have taken the former heartland of what might be the economic rationalist, socially progressive part. They've taken that away from the Liberals. How do you get that combination together to provide a united story that provides circumstances, as you did get in the early 1980s, to say we've got to do a lot of things. So I think there's a fair bit of work to do, and the next year and more will basically be about trying to preserve as much of the foundations as possible amid all the madness.
Oh, thank you, Michael. Just going back in the past, our dear friend Porrick McGuinness, with whom I had the pleasure of spending a very long lunch at the Sackville Hotel, and what a genius he is. Just two things. One, micro. We have all this iron ore we're shipping overseas. I keep going to this. How are we going to develop a tertiary industry on this? We have the skill. We have people coming here. That's the first question, micro. Macro, energy. China is building 6 to 8 nuclear power stations a month. What do you see as the future in our energy mix?
By that the iron ore, you mean how do we turn it into steel? Yes. Well, the great hope there is like we are uncompetitive in doing that by conventional means. We had a steel industry. We're subscale. It's more efficient to dig it all up as we do very efficiently. That iron ore underneath the ground, it's all just a bunch of rocks. It's worth nothing there underneath the ground until someone comes along, it's in the middle of nowhere, digs it up at massive scale, and then ships it over to somewhere else, and they can do it more efficiently. That's been the basis of the comparative advantage and how we've produced a very wealthy society. So it's good to be able to process more, but we do have a comparative advantage in raw materials exporting. The big hope in all of this is through, you get on the whole green steel thing, that if we can get cheap renewable energy, we can go one stage further on the green iron, one stage further, and ship that off as I understand it's the magnetite, not the hematite. If we can do more of that, we can ship it over there and go one stage up the value chain. So I think it's good to be able to do, but you've got to be able to be at scale, and you've got to be efficient at doing that. And we're a high cost-based country. And the second part of it again was on nuclear, of course. Well, this is a big debate that I think clearly we don't have nuclear power in Australia fundamentally through the history of it, not because of ideology and politics. Recall that in the 60s, nuclear was seen as a space age almost it was a sign of progress. We had some great nuclear physicists, Mark Oliphant, Rex Connor, and Gough Whitlam would have gone for nuclear power. And I think they did, and we were at the forefront. We wanted to follow the Brits with nuclear power. Now, it didn't get up in Australia, not because of ideology, because we had so much damn cheap coal that you could just scoop up basically close to cities and turn that into cheap electricity. So it wasn't cost competitive at that time. Now the question is, then we banned it, stupidly. Howard had to do that deal with the Democrats, I think, on something. And so we've got a ban. Obviously, clearly, there shouldn't be a ban on anything like this. And I think the debate over safety is basically sort of gone, because Peter Malinowskis is going to have nuclear power plants in his harbour with the AUKUS ships there. So with AUKUS, that part of it is gone, apart from the remnants of the sort of green left, if they want to bring it up. But for young people, I think the safety thing is not really a thing. They haven't grown up with that whole midnight oil sort of Anthony Albanese protest sort of thing. So that's all sort of gone. It does come down to, I think, to the economics of it. Excuse me. And I think that is that's one for the market to choose. Clearly, I think the issue is it is going to take. We are starting from behind. The small modular reactors hold great hope, and maybe they come into play. It is going to take some time. The thing for the coalition, I think, is how do you get from here to there, and how do you reduce power prices in the meantime? So doing something that's going to take, I'm certainly not against it, and it might, we should sort of bring that into the mix and everything. But between now and then, how do we get the power prices down so we become competitive again? And that's a challenging thing.
Thank you, and thank you for your speech. As a more young person, it was great to have a bit of a history lesson. One question that I had, I guess, was around the idea of entrepreneurialism and the fact that globally we might be a little bit hampered in terms of how encouraged young people are to be entrepreneurs, particularly with, the fact that we can maybe rest on our laurels in terms of our resources, in terms of high regulation, in terms of relatively high taxation. We understand that globally, compared to other countries in the world. I was just wondering your sort of historical, maybe, reflections on that in the last 40 decades, and if we do sort of have that crisis now, particularly with your comments on the low growth that we're looking at in the future.
Well, I think it's in an encouraging way. I think there's still quite a lot. There's a lot of entrepreneurial spirit in Australia, and there always has been. When you look at, say, the Financial Review rich list, the great bulk of people on the rich list are self-made people. And they might be not, and what you might think of like an entrepreneur or a tech entrepreneur or something today. Some of them are, like the Atlassians, Richard White with Wise Tech, Canva. So we do have some really good examples of tech entrepreneurs. And the thing is today, with technology, you can build a global business incredibly quickly these days. So there is more than there used to be. The thing is, I think, how can we, reduce regulation to encourage, or do ways to encourage all that? I think that's a very valid thing to look at and try and promote. Taxes are high. There's a lot of regulation. How do we get a Silicon Valley type mentality in some way to encourage all of this? That's something we do really have to work on. I think getting the basics right, getting your tax system right, getting your IR system right, getting more opportunity for people to get ahead is a thing really worth focusing on.
Okay, so just hang on a second. There's a question there, and then we go Shan, then we go Anthony. See how we go. We've got about 15 minutes. Okay, all right. So
Thank you.
Everyone's got to be brief. Okay.
Thank you. The resources being our mainly source of income as a country over the last decades, currently under a fair bit of an attack by activists, gold, gas, coals. When do we push the panic button on activists stopping our income and saying, right, we have nothing else left to generate income from? Or is there anything to protect from that?
Yeah, I think that's a really big issue that needs to be really taken on. Like with the gas and with the crocodile man that was supposedly entered the water someplace 10,000 years ago and actually couldn't have done that because there was no water there because it was all one big land bridge. And clearly there's an activist thing, a white activist thing, that is using and exploiting Aboriginal Dreamtime things to try and stop development. And the gold case is another quite astounding case. It's just, you think about it, is this really happening? So I think there is a real big, and it's in the wake of the Voice, so that's left, where does everything go after the Voice? Clearly there has to be some reconciliation of all of this, but as Warren Mundine up the back has said very, very, very eloquently in the pages of the Financial Review, those mining developments are a one way for a lot of the Indigenous communities to really get economic advance. And so it's really need to focus on how the thing that really has made Australia a prosperous country, how that can, and it does provide right now, a lot of jobs for Indigenous people, and there's quite a lot of native title over a lot of the Australian landmass. How can you get the incentives right so that they seem to benefit from it, and you can line up and get some rigour around the processes to say, how do we resolve all this? Because I think it is the green and the Indigenous thing together. How are we going to, because we're supposedly, we're going to supply all the world's copper and lithium and rare earths, but you try starting up a mine these days.
Okay, so we're going to go Shan, Dimitri, Anthony, Justin. Okay, got to be quick.
My question is, what do you think about the future of centralised stock securities exchanges, where Australia led the world to trade for companies to trade their own shares, and we now have a lot of electronic platforms where you could let any company to trade its own shares on condition they disclose the beneficial owners, so people could actually discover prices against insider traders. So is there a future for stock exchanges that are covert and keep secret and poison capitalism?
Sorry, Shan, you've got a great interest in that area, and I'd have to say I don't think I can really add a lot to your expertise on that subject, I'm afraid. Thank you.
Thanks for your comments, Michael. That was Intel, by the way, the chip company, which is in structural decline, and which Ed Huzik has said several times it was a mistake to not support them.
It was Intel. Yeah.
My question is that the difference between 40 years ago to today is there's a big demographic issue with an ageing population, and with age comes a different approach to risk. Older people are looking more to protect wealth rather than acquire wealth. They're looking for more regulation. They're looking for more income taxes and less wealth taxes. Are we on track to become, rather than the white trash of Asia, the old white trash of Asia?
I suppose we've all got thanks Dimitri, even as we get older, we've got an interest in the system working well and to be able to continue to generate the income to hold up the very generous bargain that's through the superannuation system that some superannuants are receiving. On the youth thing, personally, I think that's a reason why we should keep going with a very strong immigration program. Australia is not a big population country. I think it's not the complete answer to demographic ageing. Much of the world's population is now, in many countries, is now falling, whereas it's almost like the gravity of the thing. I think there's more scope for people to come to Australia, and younger people, and we want to get the best people from around the world, people who want to get ahead. In the rich list, a lot of them are migrants in our rich list who have come to Australia and think this is a land of opportunity. So I think injecting some immigration of people who really want to get ahead and really appreciative of being in a country like this, which is an opportunity frontier economy, it would be the thing I'd say to try and counter that.
Stutch, thanks very much, and great summary, and thanks for the whole Stutch show over many years. Hi, Tiki. Business. Just thinking about what the opportunity or the requirement's going to be on business in Australia to sell the case for reform, the way it may have in bits and pieces in the 80s and then the 90s, Corrigan, NFF, Waterfront. What is that opportunity or requirement for the businesses that might have enough resources and thinking and it being enough in their interests beyond what they have to do with ESG and everything else?
Yes, thanks, Anthony. I think there is a real role for business, big business and business generally, in being part of forming a coalition to form a narrative and a case for basically a growth agenda. And I think business does need to really play a role in this. I think they have vacated it a bit. They've been sidetracked by a lot of ESG, etc. things, and not to say that's a totally bad thing, but I think you will see the ESG on the back foot because they've gone in saying, yes, we're going to completely decarbonise our company by whatever. Turns out that's dependent on an electricity supply that's green, and that's not going to happen as quickly as you thought. And I think as well as people start to question where's the growth coming from, people start to say, well, our director class, our managerial class, perhaps needs to focus on the real task at hand. Is there anybody here who knows how to run a business and can make some money? So I think there'll be a emphasis on companies to do that, and we should put it on corporate sector to try and focus on these things. There's a lot of corporate box ticking of various things. There's a bit of virtue signalling, and it's not all bad. It is a modern world and all these sort of things. And we do need to change and keep up with modern society. But focus on the task at hand. Businesses are mainly here to generate goods and services that people want to buy, to generate profits, to employ people, to generate the taxes that pay for all the things. You're starting to see it a little bit, I think, with Mike Henry at BHP, Matt Common the other day before the parliamentary committee. So I think it's there to gather business leaders just to say, let's start to focus on the basics again.
Second last question.
You referred to the.
Yep.
You referred to the two airline policy that we used to suffer under, but we're however many years along from the privatisation of Qantas. Are things really much better from the consumer standpoint, or are we consigned to really only ever be able to support two airlines in this country?
Yeah, aviation's a difficult industry, but the two airline agreement was Reg Ansett and the government-owned airline, and everything was regulated. Like all the fares, the timetables, everything went in lockstep. So I think anything would be better than that. We do want to promote competition in the airlines, and the Financial Review broke the story that the Labor government year rejected Qatar Airlines' application to fly more. Why on earth would they do that? At a time of excess demand for airlines, a government rejected an international airline's offer to fly more services in and out of Australia. Why would that happen? So I think there's a bit of work on the slots. It all gets a bit complicated, the slots and all this sort of thing. Qantas will be put through a bit of a ringer, which is probably a good thing, through the ACCC and so forth. But you're not going to get 5 or 6 airlines probably flying all around Australia. It will be a small number, that's history shown, but at least you hope to keep it deregulated, and the opportunity for entry would be a good thing.
Just a final question. You seem to be in pretty good form tonight. So what does a former editor-in-chief of the Financial Review do next? And have you thought about Isabel's suggestion, implied suggestion, that maybe this talk makes a good book?
Yes, well, it's been a great privilege to be editor-in-chief of Financial Review for 13 years. It was a record. I was the oldest Financial Review editor-in-chief ever, so you think, yeah, maybe it is time. I can say, and it's not. You don't see this everywhere in modern media because it's been a tough industry. It's gone through a lot of tech change. Before, the very high barriers to start. Now, everyone's a publisher. Which is both a real competitive threat, but also an opportunity, because when everyone's a publisher, you do need to have credible, reliable news and information and people are busy and they want to go to one thing. And the Financial Review, amongst all this, has managed to carve out a business model in a particular area, because in business, in politics, people are more prepared to pay, or better still, their boss pays for it, even better. And it's a defined market, as opposed to much general news is commoditised news. It's very commoditised out there, so it's hard to make money about it. You've got to do something to get people who are willing to pay for your actual content. So I've been able to say that we've come through all this. Certainly been hard at sometimes, and sometimes you think, is this all going to work? But with a business model that has really never been more profitable, and so that's a good thing, at least in Australia, to be able to sustain at least a small number of upright, serious mastheads with serious traditional newsrooms that apply the old-fashioned traditions of journalism. You go out and get the story, it's got to go through a certain discipline and rigour of process of the newsroom and the news editors, and it's got to abide by that. It's just not a bunch of bloggers blogging away doing anything, just filing into something. So I think there is a story to tell in all of that. There's a story to tell in how the economy's gone and how Australia's gone from being a mediocre country to being a very prosperous country, and what do we do now to try and sustain all that. There's a story and all that, and so maybe they can merge together in some way, and I'll throw a little bit of Joe Aston into there as well, and there you go.
Thank you. Well, thanks for that. I think I met Michael probably 40 years ago. I'm not sure whether you're working for the Fin Review or the Australian. You were in Melbourne. I was in Fin Review. And that was a terrific performance tonight, and the paper will be very valuable. I mean, it's the kind of thing that really should be looked at in schools and universities, as someone get an impartial view of 40 years of economic development with the pluses and the minuses included. I won't go on. A lot of people here. Everyone's busy. Well done. Thank you.